Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Wildlife and Fire in the Southwest webinar series. Today, this is our fifth and final webinar in this series, and we are going to be focusing on communication to improve wildlife outcomes. I'm very excited to welcome all of you and to welcome our four panelists today. I am sure this is going to be a very interesting session that was highly requested at our January workshop. I'm Lexi Newkirch. I work for the Rocky Mountain Research Station as a science delivery specialist based in Fort Collins, Colorado. And after I do this quick intro today, we will then hear presentations and stories from our panelists, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A. So this Wildlife and Fire series was created by a very large team of partners, including the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Southwest Fire Science Consortium, USDA Forest Service Region 3 and Rocky Mountain Research Station, US Fish and Wildlife Service, and all of the other agencies and groups whose logos are listed here on this slide. It was a big effort from all of us here. This group created this year-long series of workshops and webinars and reports to improve wildlife outcomes in the face of fire. And this series of webinars has been intended to help researchers and practitioners across different disciplines of wildlife and fire to exchange tools and ideas and lessons for working within the rapid pace and scale of fire management, specifically in the Southwest. Each of the webinars in this series has focused on a topic that was identified by our 200 virtual workshop participants as something that they wanted to hear about more and discuss in greater detail in January. And we will also be discussing the outcomes of these workshops and webinars at a special session during the 4th Southwest Fire Ecology Conference in Santa Fe next month. As you registered, we already gathered some really great questions from you all, and those will be used to help begin our discussion today after our presentations. But if you have any more additional questions or comments for our panelists, please put them into the chat at any time and we will get to them. As a quick note, if you are a member of the media or if you're with a congressional office, I ask you to please coordinate any information requests with the Rocky Mountain Research Station Public and Legislative Affairs Office. I will add their information into the chat for you. And I want to acknowledge and thank Rachel Bean, who has been working behind the scenes on this webinar to keep us rolling smoothly, and you will see information in the chat box from her to complement what we are saying up here. We are recording this webinar today, so if you'd like to watch the recording again, or if you want to share it with a colleague who couldn't attend, it will be posted on the RMRS webinar page, and I will also drop that link into the chat as soon as I am done. While we don't have a translator today, Spanish captions will be available on the recording at that link. I am very excited to welcome our panelists today. We will be hearing from Julia Camp, Dennis Carroll, Jack Williams, and Joel Iverson, and then getting into a great discussion with all four of them. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and then I will introduce our first speaker, Julia. Julia is a wildlife biologist with over 20 years of experience in land management and research with the federal government, nonprofit organizations, and consulting across the Western US in the South and in the Southeast. She has worked for the US Forest Service since 2010 and is currently a wildlife biologist on the Flagstaff Ranger District of the Coconino National Forest in northern Arizona. All right, Julia, your slides look great, so I will hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Lexi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really bad at talking really fast, so I'm going to attempt to talk slow enough that you all know what I'm talking about. And here I am talking about improving communication between wildlife and fire managers, yet I talk too fast. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all today and share a little bit of what I've learned over my time working as a wildlife biologist with fire. And right off the bat, I can't. You want to advance, I swear. Okay, there we go. Yay. Anyway, I think we can all relate to this photo here because we've all been in situations where we probably felt like at least one of these people or all of them when we've been trying to communicate with people. Obviously, all of our jobs, communication is key, right? So what I wanted to do today was just share a few tips that I've found effective for me as a wildlife biologist talking with fire managers. And hope that you can avoid situations like this in the future. So first off, I just want to describe a couple of situations to give you a little bit of an idea. I mean, I know we all have our side of the fence on this one, but just so like this situation. Now, if a wildlife biologist goes out and looks at this and they're preparing for prescribed burn in this area, right? I might look at this and be amazed at the number of logs out there and think this is a great, and I want to see them all stay forever because maybe there's a species of rodent that just needs all those logs to live. But then my fuel specialist comes out and looks at this and sees this as like way too many things on the ground, and definitely wants to see like less out there with this prescribed fire, whereas I may feel like they all need to be retained. Because if they stay out there from the fire manager's perspective, this could cause the loss of the stand during fire season later when it's dry and hot and windy. So also with this photo, another one, I might go out there as a wildlife biologist and immediately look at the ground and notice like, oh, wow, that's like moderate fire severity effects. And now I'm worried about flooding and how that's going to affect the things living on the ground because all the litter was consumed. Whereas the fuel specialist is most likely going to go out, look up, and be very disappointed that there aren't a lot of red needles in the trees and that maybe there wasn't a lot of effects made. So the stand is still set up for like uncharacteristic fire when fire season rolls around. So what's the challenge here? What do these two situations show? Well, oftentimes biologists and fire managers can look at the same situation and have completely different takes on that. And what no surprise to anyone would be, this comes from our differences in backgrounds and experiences, right? I might have a wildlife degree, a fire manager, I'm married to a wildland firefighter, he has an English lit degree. So you have all these kind of differences that go that way. And so if you don't work to try to figure out where people are coming from and like work on those differences, it can lead to conflict. And a lot of times that means we're not getting a lot of stuff down on the ground because we're spending a lot of time arguing over things or disagreeing or maybe going to our two corners and not really talking to each other. So the best way I've found to deal with this is like to just accept, hey, we do have those differences. We do have those in backgrounds and experiences, and that's going to lead to us looking at these things differently and often communicating differently. So what solutions have I found? I embrace the differences. The best thing, I mean, most of what I've learned about prescribed fire and wildfire has come from the effort. Like I've talked to fire managers, I've asked those questions, whether it's people I work with on the units or when we have teams come in for like suppressing a wildfire. Like I'm not afraid to ask those questions because that's not my background, right? I also don't expect them as a wildlife biologist to understand why that little rodent might be important. So I think the best way you can go about this is trying to bridge those gaps, right? I put it here as AKA go in the field and ask questions. There are no dumb questions. And for a lot of us, we spend way too much time in the office. So I really encourage you to take the time to really get to know people. I mean, I've seen the tension when I showed up on this unit. There was a lot of tension between fire folks and wildlife because there was just, there wasn't good communication. And so I feel like that's one of those things that I've really benefited from because I just ask. And once that conversation starts, oftentimes the questions just keep going back and forth and you can learn from each other. And, those differences allow that, right? I have a different viewpoint on one thing and then maybe they have a different one on another. So, I mean, looking back at the logs conversation, if we go out there and talk about it, we might be able to find out, hey, I'm thinking when you burn this, all those logs are going to go away. But the fire managers can be able to take me places and say, hey, look, here's where they were retained. And maybe in the long run, we're actually going to get the same result. We just didn't know it until we talked about it. I'm like, the same thing's true with the fire severity. That one I've seen as long as I've been in fire. A lot of times, biologists and other ologists look down and they look at the ground, they see what's there and don't look up. So going out and talking about it and looking different things and getting that idea of what this means overall is like a big deal. So I am not saying that this is a magical like tool that will fix everything and you'll all be wonderful. But for me, it's been really great to just take that step, ask those questions and learn from the other person, try to figure out, use those differences to our advantage instead of having them work against us. Another thing for wildlife biologists, oftentimes when you're involved with planning for an Arctic burn or you're dealing with assisting with wildfire suppression, the first thing you think is like, oh my gosh, what species are here? And you can come up with this big long list of all the species, all the habitat, everything that's there. And actually it can be pretty overwhelming. So what I advise is not to be me. The first time I was asked to work on a fire, I think I pretty much created a map that looked like this with every possible thing on the face of the planet I could put on there because I felt like everything was a concern. Now, I'm not saying it isn't, but when you try to put all these species on one map, like how do you exactly explain to somebody how they're supposed to work around everything that's on there, right? And so the person I gave this map to, the fire person, he actually like smirked and looked at me and he said he wanted to double check to make sure that there wasn't anything else I wanted to add because there were a few empty spots that we might want to put more in there. So we had a good laugh about that, and then I went back to my office and tried to figure out a way to really portray that information, that the most important information to go forward. So what are the challenges with this? As much as it pains me to say this, wildlife is not the only concern when we're talking about fire, right? Very hard to say, but totally true. Fire managers and decision makers, they're having to worry about all sorts of different resource areas, recreation, archaeology, hydrology, but they all have to take into consideration things like firefighter safety, public safety, where's the smoke going to go, the cost of implementing, and so on. So really, it's on wildlife to understand you aren't the only concern, and you're really going to have to kind of narrow down what the most important information is. But what information is that? And that can definitely be a challenge. And how do you figure it out? Well, my suggestion with that one and what worked for me was try to keep it simple. When it comes, you need to narrow down to the key habitat components in that area and those sorts of things. Like, again, you might have one kind of overarching species that actually benefit everyone. I know we don't want to talk single species management. I'm not saying that, but oftentimes, like in the case of, say, Mexican spotted owl, which on my district, we joke, can't throw a rock without hitting one. That's one that we use to guide, but that's also going to benefit everything else. All the songbirds, all the invertebrates, all the elk, deer, little mammals, everything. So everybody's going to kind of benefit if you're looking at those key habitat components and focusing in on those things you're looking to retain during that prescribed fire, or those sorts of things like that. Oops. That's what happens when you go backwards. Anyway, the big thing again, and this is a similar thing for my first thing, is ask for help, right? No one expects you to walk in the door as a new biologist or even someone new to the unit and know everything. Like, again, I am not afraid to ask questions. There are no dumb questions. And the only way to really learn, like you can go, one of the things you could do is be reading research papers and things like that, but talking to the people who are doing the work themselves is also a great resource too. So don't shy away from that. Whether it's hitting up someone like me, I mean, there's a decent number of us in the Forest Service who've been here for a while, but there's a lot of new folks too. And, don't be afraid to the biggest thing I want to stress out of this is building your strong relationships with biologists across agencies. For me, I got here and I was very fortunate when I got to this district, and I had some very experienced biologists on this forest, and they were always willing to help me. But I think the thing that's allowed, the Coconino is very well known for getting a lot of our burning on the ground. We've managed a lot of wildfires, gotten a lot of acres done. And I attribute that to the fact that we have a very, very strong relationship with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So our geographic lead is always willing to support us and help us. And she's our best partner. She's also a very good source for me to ask some of those dumb questions too. And so through working with her, we have been able to get so much more done on this unit. And so I strongly encourage you not only to talk to the people on your unit or in the Forest Service, but don't be afraid to go outside agencies. And obviously in this case with wildlife, the people who manage those individual organisms of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I strongly encourage you to go that route. Oops. And then wow, go Julia. Doing good here. And with that, I only have one more slide. I just wanted to stress one thing and just say, my ending thought is bad communication ends a lot of good things. So really take it upon yourself as a wildlife biologist or a fire manager, or whoever you are, to really build those relationships, communicate with other people, ask questions, get out in the field. I spend too much time in the office, so I need to take my own advice. But anyway, that's all I had to share with you all. And thanks for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was lovely. We will go on over to our next speaker now, Dennis. Dennis Carroll has worked for the Forest Service for 22 years in fire fuels and aviation. A majority of his career has been spent in northern New Mexico on the Santa Fe National Forest, with time also spent on the Carson National Forest and currently on the Cibola National Forest. His focus over the last 12 years has been collaborating internally with different specialists and externally with a variety of partners to implement restoration projects across northern New Mexico. All right, Dennis, I am seeing your PowerPoint screen.
Okay, let me know when you see it coming live.
I'm still just seeing your slides here.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
Okay, all right. No, thanks. I want to say thanks to Lexi and Rachel for the invite and all the coordination leading up to the webinar. Everybody for joining, and Julia, fantastic presentation. You hit on a lot of the same things that I think about in my experiences and throughout my career with working with wildlife biologists. And like you said, it's not just wildlife biologists. It's a big proponent of what we do, but it's everybody getting along with everybody between archaeologists, hydrologists, wildlife biologists, agency administrators, you name it. It's a complicated, dynamic environment to where communication is key. So uh, I've got just a few slides. It's really just pictures. It's kind of to trigger my mind about a couple of different experiences and things I want to share with folks. But I want to kind of pick up on the conversation about really picking up where Rachel left off about relationships and communication. Relationships, what I've found, are one of the most important things to facilitating getting meaningful work done on the ground as land managers. It's oftentimes we look at things from our own perspective, whether it's my view through fire and fuels or vice versa with any other specialist. But what I have found, some of the most important things is like when I was a lot younger, when I first started this aspect of restoration work, the first part of my career was doing straight up suppression and then seeing kind of the outputs of what suppression does and not necessarily the best outcomes for wildlife or communities or a lot of different things that kind of pushed me to the proactive side of the business of land management. In some of those early interactions and things with different specialists, it was really surprising to me, like how kind of I don't know, isolated, or how sometimes we work in our own little vacuum. We're the star of our own show and our own resource specialty. But it didn't take long to quickly figure out. It's like I in order to get something done, to meet and find the common ground in a decision space to go forward with something like a prescribed fire, having that under a big thing I found, it's not just understanding your own specialty, but taking the time to understand the specialty of the people you're working with. We had an MSO injunction in 2019, and I learned a lot about Mexican spotted owls through reading the recovery plan and talking to all the different biologists about their interpretations of everything that's required or possible under that plan and still actively managing. Julia also mentioned a very important piece in talking with Fish and Wildlife Service. Our biologists on the different forests I've worked on have been so accommodating to invite us fuels people to those meetings, to have the conversations, to bring our perspective from fire and fuels to the hard conversations about how do we manage for endangered species. Um, and a lot of what I found is there is a way, and it's finding common ground against the different things. And we are bound to the Endangered Species Act and all the things that are tied to wildlife management within our forest plans. And all the species are, I don't know about equally as important, like that's not up to me. But as a collective, I started to shift my way of thinking and learning, and still do, about individual species, but really shifting my conceptual thinking of my conversation with everybody, be it line officers or biologists, to ecosystem process and not just single species management. We're really thinking about how it all ties together and what some of the common threads are. And what I found, like with fire, wildfire, prescribed fire, but just the ecological process of fire, that there's a common thread amongst a lot of our different resource areas, wildlife included, tied to habitat and understanding what we know about fire regimes and fire ecology. And a lot of the times we're meeting a lot of the same objectives in regard to wildlife, in regard to fire and fuels, in regard to hydrology, in regard to values at risk with infrastructure. Thinking about things in terms of reestablishing the ecosystem process is where I've kind of drifted in my career to, like, taking in all the different pieces and all the accounts, finding the common ground, resolving any sort of differences, but overarching, I think we can all agree that fire is part of the landscape. So we're going to have different ways from different perspectives of how we tweak that. But sticking on that ecosystem process side of things has been really important. And I'll re-stress the relationship side of that. I'm a passionate person, and it comes across, and I've gotten better the older I get about like calming down and maybe being less passionate, but like really trying to understand the other side and form true relationships with these people. Like Julia said, she's been at Flagstaff for 12 years. I was at Santa Fe for 12 years. And having those relationships with your different specialists and then also your outside partners and maintaining those, it's how work gets done, in my opinion, in a meaningful way at significant scale, whether you're doing RX planned fire or managing wildfire or even suppressing wildfire. And I'll be the first to say that fire folks are not sometimes the most forthcoming or easiest people to talk to. I've noticed that myself, and I'm a burn boss type 2. I'm a division group supervisor with Incident Management Team 3 here in the Southwest. What I've learned is it's very important to be humble and to be thoughtful about how you go about your interactions and conversations, whether it's at the ID team meeting level with the local district or whether you're being hosted by a different forest and you're there to suppress a fire. I really think about things on both sides of that as a customer service thing. So trying to be there to serve and to meet the objectives of the people that are that you're working for. Now to the pictures. I only got a couple minutes left before I hit time. I've had a lot of great opportunities through my career. We're looking at a picture here in the Santa Fe National Forest in Stable Canyon. It's an occupied spotted owl pack. And working with the biologist at the district and at the forest level and with Fish and Wildlife Service, there was a lot of support around implementing this fire. And this is canyon country where the where the pack is in this particular burn unit. And we burn the entire canyon system outside of breeding season and working with them to target the different severities we were going for. So being this was a canyon one, a big steep chunk of ground with mixed conifer, in an occupied owl pack, we really aimed for the low side of severity and effects. And we did. We got a good mix of low and moderate, and it was a really successful project. The last half of what I'm going to talk about is bringing money through partnerships through the folks that manage habitat and it can bring money in. New Mexico Game and Fish has been one of my biggest partners throughout the years, working with thinning projects, burning projects, hiring contractors for us to do burn prep, to do cut and pile, to bring money in for overtime, to pay firefighters to staff burns, along with helicopter costs, you name it. Game and Fish has literally pumped millions of dollars into restoration efforts all across New Mexico, but in particular, my time on the Santa Fe has been fantastic. With that entity, and then also other ones, Jack, who's going to speak here shortly, reminded me I forgot about like working with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation years ago in our biologists locally to line out the objectives of some particular project areas, do a great proposal, implement about 5,000 acres of prescribed fire under that proposal, and then give them a bunch of great information to share with their constituents about how they're putting those donations to the ground via restoration efforts. Efforts like that. I've done a little work with Wild Turkey Federation, but these relationships and partnerships, both internally or externally, are so important to what we do in meeting the objective of not only pace and scale, but just managing land in general. And again, I'll just reiterate and draw this common thread. I'm a hunter too. I spend time in the woods. I gather firewood. Again, I do wildfire, prescribed fire. I love my time in the mountains. And it's really interesting to watch a lot of these projects get implemented, some of the amazing wildlife you see, and some of the common threads we draw between the different objectives between the different specialty areas in the land management realm. So that's all I have. I think I'm about at time, and just really ending with a pretty picture at nighttime here with some fire. That's all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you.
All right, I want to give a quick reminder that if any questions pop up from the audience at any time, you can pop those into the chat and we will grab them for you. Next up, I'm introducing our next speaker, who is Jack. Jack has worked since 2016 as the Forest Service Southwestern Region 3 T&E terrestrial biologist. He works throughout the Southwest to conserve threatened, endangered, and sensitive species. He currently is a team member on the New Mexico Meadow Jumping Mouse Recovery Team, Sacramento Mountains Checker Spot Butterfly Working Team, and the Region 3 Mexican Spotted Owl Strategy Team. All right, Jack, waiting for your slides to come up here. It's loading. Awesome, looks good. But we cannot hear you.
There you go.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, normally I don't get it. People always can hear me, unfortunately. No. Hello, all. My name is Jack Williams. I work for the U.S. Forest Service at our Southwestern Regional Office. And my job is predominantly threatened and endangered species. But again, I want to thank everyone to giving me an opportunity to kind of talk about communication and about natural resources, both of them that I think are extraordinarily important. And one good thing is that, over time, I've been able to have lessons learned as a new biologist back in the day with the Forest Service. And I think it's amazing that I'm working with a lot of folks that I think are online that are newer, and that, they're trying to get a better idea of how to handle all these different situations. So this is, my opportunity to kind of give a kind of a lessons learned and just kind of go through a couple of slides and then get to the really good stuff when it comes to talk about the questions and stuff. But my thing is I'm going to tie into the specifics on how to deal with fires, a big fire. Okay. And because, if you're working for the federal government or states or different other stuff, and you're kind of working one way or the other, unfortunately, now we're having to deal with big fires, mega fires over and over. And so you really can't isolate yourself, especially if you're different parts of the country, you're always dealing with fire suppression and such. But I wanted to kind of give a nuance on one particular element that ties into wildlife management, natural resources, and dangerous to dealing with the fire suppression activity. Basically, if you were a biologist on a unit and you had a fire, there would be different levels of complexity associated to each type of fire. There's different levels of teams. I'm not going to get into all that kind of stuff, but usually different levels, higher complexity has different levels of monies and folks and different positions that are normally all tied to each type of fire assignment. And some fire assignments have just full on fire suppression. You're really mostly just focusing on trying to put it out, or some are broader, larger. And in some opportunities, you do have a chance to have a way to actually have some advantages associated to allow some resource benefit type of activities to help out the natural resource. So it's not just putting everything out, but also actually allowing some things to occur that have a for sure positive, that are not just about preventing it from being burned up. But the one position I'm going to focus on is called a resource advisor. They call it READ. There's also a new nuance tied to it called a REEF. A REEF is basically the same thing as a resource advisor, but you're fire line qualified. And there's different types of specialists. You have soil scientists, you have wildlife biologists, fire, hydros, archaeological archies are all tied to being reefs or reeds. Now, this is just kind of give you an example of different types of positions that are tied into a fire assignment. Again, the different types of complexities can have a variety of more people, but I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of, on a real big fire assignment, you've got tons of people, different resources and stuff. And so this would just kind of give you an idea that as a READ, you're one component of a whole team. Okay, so you've got a big fire assignment, things are going on. Well, how do you integrate or help fish and wildlife conservation into a wildfire situation. Okay, in some circumstances, you're just trying to, in some circumstances, with some types of fire, you have that nuance to be a little bit more creative. If you're just one of a few reeds on a smaller fire and it's more forest oriented, then you can really focus on some aspects. Some real large fires, you're just one of a whole team of rotation of different reeds on an entire fire assignment. So it's a matter of understanding what your role is. As a reed, it's you're giving recommendations. You're working for the forest at the administrative officer, and so you're probably more than likely on a if it's a big fire assignment, you're on a reed team. You have a lead reed. He facilitates, or that person facilitates any information that you're out in the field with, gathering intel, making sure that either certain suppression activities are put in a certain way, or if you're later in an assignment, you're doing rehab and on those specs, you're kind of facilitating what and the roles and responsibilities. Basically, with it, this is just another example of what a reed can do. Some reeds you're working with putting in a dozer, and you're putting in a fire line. In some circumstances, you're maybe rescuing listed fish that are more than likely going to be wiped out if they're not pulled and extracted out. In some circumstances, you can actually give some recommendations and some advice to the team to actually maybe in some circumstances do some backburning activity that actually can not just help reduce the wildfire risk, but also help protect endangered species while still trying to meet the objectives of protecting private property, human loss, those type of things. But here's another, just more of a nuance to it. But a reed is basically a liaison between the firefighters and the fire team. Reeds communicate with the local district specialists. They gather T&E species, locations, info. They share that information with the lead reed, and then they help facilitate how to mitigate appropriately those locations with the fire suppression activities itself. Give advice to that team on different levels of either reducing some of the risk associated to the fire itself by certain type of tactics, or also helping give recommendations on mitigating some of the fire suppression activities itself. Now, in some circumstances, as a reed, you could help facilitate emergency consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, especially if it's a smaller fire, or you're giving information to the person that's actually dealing with the emergency consultation of that fire. One quick example of what you're doing on a fire team, you might be helping on the back end or in the front end of developing what they call WFDS. It's a wildland fire decision supporting system. It's not it's a way to document the decision approach to a fire assignment. It's not you have to have it done before you do any suppression activities. So much with a fire, it's just a way to help facilitate how your strategy has worked with that particular fire, and it moves and it evolves in time. Now, some aspects is that if you were a district biologist and at the beginning of the year you wanted to help put data into a WFDS process, and you thought was really important measures that would be useful to put into that WFDS, that's stuff that you would do up front. This is just another example of after a WFDS is developed, you basically are able to identify. This is an example of Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire that was on the Santa Fe and the Carson, one of the largest fire in New Mexico history. Basically, with this WFDS, we were able to identify either threatened, endangered, or state listed important species with our WFDS. One thing WFDS is doing, like I mentioned before, they're either working with the fire line individuals while they're putting the line in, or they're also helping facilitate the best recommendations into doing resource rehab to those fire suppression activities after the fires is complete. Now, one thing associated with there's different other rules, making sure that you do a quad of invasive species and weed decontamination. So basically all the ins and outs of trying to reduce the effects of actually putting the suppression activities and actually making things worse in the long term. And this is just another example of using a bad situation and actually getting some rehabbing and then thinking for the future. This is a location where we had some Rio Grande cutthroat trout locations that were going to be really threatened with monsoonal precipitation later in the year. And so you had a crew that worked together with the Game and Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service to go in, collect a lot of these populations and take them and rescue them, put them aside, and then work on rehabbing the system in the future, and then safely reintroducing those streams back with the species that we were able to collect. Now, one thing again, dealing with being a reed or a wildlife biologist up front, there's so many different things I can't talk about in 10 minutes, but it's the idea that you have to understand your species. You think at the beginning of the year, okay, how am I going to approach this? Where are the important areas that I really need to key in on? What kind of suppressions are they more than likely to implement in these areas? How could I help recommend mitigation measures and such? Those kind of things are, if you kind of brainstorm, you get those things in and you're ready, then when a fire summit does come, then you really know the important things to present to a team, and because you prioritize, okay, and you've learned how to adapt. You have to adapt quite a bit when you're a resource advisor and a biologist on a fire assignment. You're just giving recommendations. So you try to think out, okay, where are the areas that I really need to try to communicate on, to really make sure they're really important. And it's not just the team, but it's actually being out there on the fire assignment with the firefighter, trying to get that credibility, that street cred, by getting out there and helping and getting dirty and understanding and communicating, and having those fire line specialists on the fire understand how important it is, and that you're taking time with explaining things to them. All that kind of investment and communication is going to help you, but it's also going to help those other biologists that those same people have to deal with on other fire assignments. They've had a really good positive interaction with resource specialists, and they say, hey, there's those biologists, that they're really cool, they're passionate, they're adaptive, those kind of things. You're not just helping your resource and your district or your forest, but also those other forests that you might be representing on another fire assignment. Again, I think I'm done with my presentation, but I'm excited to answer any other questions and try to give some life lessons.
Thank you so much, Jack. That's awesome. We will continue on to our final speaker, Dr. Joel Iverson. He is a professor of communication studies at the University of Montana. His research focuses on the communicative processes of organizing at group, organizational, and community levels, with an emphasis in risk and crisis communication. His theoretical developments include the 4 flows model of communication and communities of practice theory. Recently, he has applied these approaches to a range of contexts, including wildland fire policy, wildland firefighting, agricultural biosecurity, earthquake forecasting, health support groups, volunteer management, and nonprofit organizations. For the USDA Forest Service, he advises on the enterprise risk management, training for senior leader and line officer academy, communicating about wildland fire and strategy, as well as researching with the Human Dimensions program at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. All right, Joel, I am seeing your slides and they look great. You can take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been great. I'm learning a lot about being a wildlife resource person. I didn't know what a reed is. There's a lot of this I don't know. I do have I've had a few years of working around wildland fire and trying to help them expand their thinking. And this really reinforces that for me. My hope is to shift our thinking a little bit about to how to be mindful, because Julia talked about, embracing differences, and it's about relationships. And Dennis and Jack really said the same thing with different aspects of it, how to learn and understand and work with each other. And this is something we naturally do when we communicate. And so I'm hoping to just prompt some thinking, and then at the end offer a couple of tools for specific messaging. So as we think about, and I click on my slides, we think about what communication is. A lot of times when we think about communication, what we end up focusing on is the information sharing, that my job is simply to hand people information, but it's a lot more than that. And I think all of the other people who are talking today, and I'm sure with your own experiences, that information alone doesn't change thinking. It's information is an important part of what we communicate, but a lot more is happening, right? We're helping people to understand what's at value. We're understanding other people's emotions and ideas. And that helps us really frame messages. We'll talk about that a little bit, as well as the role of using narrative stories and examples to help communicate what you want, as well as listening to what others want. Because in the end, communication is the way we enact our relationships. It is about dialogue and interaction, not just handing information back and forth. If that was true, email and other communication technology would have made our communication issues better, not more complicated and worse. So when we think about that, when you are communicating, you aren't just transferring that information. You aren't just helping decision making. You are also building your workplace at the same time. You're engaging, you're building or maintaining the relationships. I love that line at the end from Julia where she said, bad communication ends a lot of good things. That is certainly true. We have choices about how we enact our workplace. And, when do we communicate matters. There are times when competence and expertise really matter as far as building trust and building those relationships. This comes from the work of Vincent Cavello on risk communication. Trust in low stress situations really does rely on competence and expertise and people understanding it. But when we shift to a high stress situation, for example, when there is smoke in the air, when there is fire, or you're on a fire, or there are values at risk, including yours, in high stress factors, dealing with the public, dealing with partners, and even coworkers, competence and expertise shrinks down to about 15 to 20%. The bigger thing is listening, caring, and empathy, being honest and open, and having the public or partners or internal folks really getting that that's where you're coming from. The phrase is, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. That really does work. So when stress is high, thinking about making sure that you emphasize that message and not just communicate in the same way you do in those situations. So when we think about that, one of the things we talk about is framing. Like, how are we framing this work? And some of the other folks have talked about that, about not just your own perspective, but listening, learning, and understanding, knowing your role as a read. All of those things are important to think about and can help you frame and set up which sort of stories that you tell, right? If we have a better consistent narrative that integrates the idea that fire is natural and always, it's been a part of the landscape, especially in a lot of the West, that you can really develop a way to think about it instead of this versus that, about an integrated overall understanding and and that allows you to prioritize what's most important, right? So in wildland firefighting, we talk about responding, right? Like every wildland fire has a response strategy. Sometimes it's going as direct as we can. Sometimes it's going more indirect so that we can allow fire to do what it does on the landscape. One of the things that I was thinking about for this group ahead of time was, can you preserve and prevent versus, what are the other goals when you think about wildland fire existing on your landscape, or when you're a reed on a fire. How can you take that broader framing perspective and help them understand? One of the places we do that work is around smoke and fire. There is no future without smoke. Smoke is necessary for some species, but also we've always had smoke in the air. So focusing your efforts in narrative around what you can prevent, rather than saying we're going to manage smoke on this wildfire, we talk about preparing the public to receive the smoke that will come from this wildfire. And that would be one example of framing differently. The other frame example that I use is how I started to think about wildland fire differently. Living in Missoula, we have bears. Bears come through every fall. The first time that happened, a bear got into my garbage, destroyed the garbage can, had a lovely picnic in my front yard. The problem wasn't the bear. Problem was me, right? I needed to behave differently. I started putting my garbage in the garage. My neighbor thought it was just a raccoon, which just seemed crazy. So he just put a brick on top of his garbage can. The next night, the bear comes through, takes out his garbage, drags it to my yard to have a picnic. And, the same sort of thing happened. And so the hazard in that sense, we like to shift the thinking from the hazard being the fire to the hazard being the condition of the landscape and maybe the type of fire that's happening on that landscape. And so how can we improve it to be ready to receive fire? And from that frame, the two questions we ask in wildland fire is, what will wildland fire find when it arrives? And what do we leave for the next wildland fire? And that's where some of those ideas, such as, back burning off of a river or stream in order to help preserve species, but also to create a better potential control line on a fire, is a great way that you can partner. Right? How do we partner to engage in a wildland strategy that encompasses everything, not just fire, but species as well? And one of those examples comes from the Stanislaus National Forest, where one of my colleagues, Allison Mims, who's part of our group called the Communication Alliance, she works for Region 6 as a communication specialist. She really talks about how we're trying to make that shift in framing and understanding when they did a large prescribed burn operation and treated it like an incident. So they talk about shifting from catastrophic wildfire to healthy forests, for example. And this is maybe a role that you all can play in that process, is helping to expand the thinking just beyond the fire and fuels, but also to think about the broad ecosystem of the forest or of the grasslands or whatever area you happen to be in. How do we make that shift to that understanding? And I think you including your story, you including what you know in that is a really important communication thing to help the Forest Service move forward in this type of communication, right? So as we think about that, how about the wildland and wildlife narrative challenges? How do you resist old meanings? How do you resist old ways of thinking? What challenges do you face, and what in turn, both in helping the public understand the ecosystem, but also internally helping others in other specialties see beyond their own specialty to include your perspectives? And so I'm going to give you a couple of tools for communicating about that. I put these roots up there, or roots, depending upon where you're from, because they're really entangled. Each of these are useful in the abstract, and think about where and when you can use them. One of those is when you're thinking about narratives, we try to get people to do and, but, and therefore. And you can look up the ABT framework. Randy Olson is his name. He has a TED Talk. He's a former Harvard biologist, I believe, a wildlife scientist who then shifted to making films. And he talks about having a better narrative instead of just listing information and. We help people understand the situation by going, and this is true, but right? We have to protect this species the best we can. Therefore, here's what I'm suggesting, right? So the and is where there's agreement or the setup. The or is where you bring up a problem or an issue or something that might contradict. And then how do those work together to get you to a solution or conclusion? And I'm going pretty fast through this. We can talk about it more if you have questions, right? And so those things let us reframe We can pivot and shift what the narrative is, getting away from the war on, whether it be the war on fire. Fire is always bad. Those examples about what do you see before there's going to be a prescribed fire, what will it look like after, I think is a great way to think about it. And how do we come out with how do we deal with the reality of enduring as well as a changing set of wildlife needs as we deal with things like climate change and that bringing in uncertainty? Second is to think about messages. And when we think about messages, think about who is your audience. If you're saying this is to a general audience, you're really communicating to no one. Who are you talking to? What is the issue or priority that they're concerned about? And if you can frame your message for their issues and concerns, it's better than just framing it from your perspective, because you have a better chance of connecting and having them see what you're saying and agree with it. What are you going to do to meet their needs, and what are you hoping that they will do? Those are sort of the 4 parts to a basic message. We have people practice that at times in making sure you do all 4 of those parts. The last one I'm going to talk about is this idea of transformative explanations. I think it's really helpful. There are a lot of misconceptions out there, and my guess is that a lot of you will spend some time at some point helping people shift from a misunderstanding to a better understanding. And what you have to really do is to meet them where they're at. So you need to state their position back to them in a way that they would accept. And you acknowledge why that seems correct, or they might believe that, and then demonstrate why that doesn't work, and then move from that to a more preferred account of what is happening. The example I use is wildland fire. When we say, fire is destructive and we should put every wildland fire out, that makes sense because we've seen where wildland fire is destructive. However, wildland fires existed on this landscape for a long time, for millennia, and humans have been utilizing wildfire on this landscape to help shape it for thousands of years. So while wildland fire can be destructive, wildland fire isn't always the problem. And so instead, we need to understand that there is no future without wildfire. There's no future without smoke. And so what we need to do is to understand and manage our landscape to better meet fire. That would be, an example of using transformative explanations. I have a couple of others to think about how to distribute models. The only important thing about this is internalization. Don't just explain, help them understand why it matters to them, right? That is one of the keys in the idea model of communication. But overall, all the advice you've gotten before, I think fits perfectly with my perspective as a communication person. How do you help that happen in your community? How do you help it happen in your organization, on your team? And how do you help others make a shift to this kind of more inclusive dialogue type communication?
Thanks, Joel. Fantastic. We are through our presentation, so I'll invite everyone who presented to turn their cameras back on and we can jump into our discussion here. Great. Awesome. So we have a couple questions to get us started here, but I still want to invite anyone who has additional questions that come up to pop them in the chat. Awesome. We've got one from Pepe. I'm going to read it out to you all just to get us started here. Read it to myself first. Awesome. Okay. Seems like there is a lot of communication before and during a fire, but how much of the learning can or does happen after the fire? What is the optimal time to revisit fires? All right, we got Rachel spotlighting our speakers here. Awesome. And then I'll just open it up if anyone would like to jump in and answer that question first.
I think with my end of learning after a fire, it's huge because it's lessons learned. It's things, I think I mentioned it before, the idea, like a lot of times, especially as a district biologist, you're coming up, you're learning at the beginning of each year, you're almost like rehearsing. You're thinking outside your head. Okay, if this happens, this is where I need to go. I need to try this. I need to prioritize that. This is maybe an area that I really want to focus on for this particular type of thing. That only comes a lot of times from learning, right? A lot of times in the past. And it gives you an idea of like, hey, this important area. I wasn't as effective in communicating and emphasize different options as much as I could have. Maybe it's things that I can learn from there. And then that's, maybe even working on one particular, your own home unit, but you can learn those type of things it also can help you ask questions on a fire assignment. Those key ones that you need for communication type of thing. Especially if you're not familiar with an area, but there's a lot of nuanced, familiar type things. You want to ask those type of questions to help you give better advice. And that comes from learning from what worked, what didn't work, and how you can refine it, at least on my end.
I'd be happy to tack on to that too, if that sounds all right. Good, Lexi. Pepe, it's good to see your name in the chat. It's been a long time, and I hope you're doing well. To answer the question, it is really important. So me personally, I was taught and kind of brought up a couple growing seasons, maybe whatever you have time for, but I always kind of think of the fiscal year as this cycle where you're prepping, planning, implementing, prepping, planning, implementing, and going through this cycle. And it's been installed in me, and it's important a couple of years after a treatment to go check it out myself. I do it on my own sometimes, but to your point, Pepe, is like to do it together. And the big one that we've really emphasized is, especially when there's money tied to these projects that people are investing in from these different outside partner agencies, is to go and take them out there and like, hey, what do you think? And like talk about it and like check to see if they're happy with how their money got spent, how it went. Has been a big one. Another one with like burning in alpacks is, like you said, like we take plots ahead of time, and a more, the field trips, the fun stuff with the partners or the specialists, they're not documented. You're right. You're right. Like we don't have any documentation from those. Are we learning? Yeah, we're having cool field trips. Some of the ways, we can document, and we do, is through following up on those plots, 2 to 3 growing seasons after a burn to get some qualitative or some quantitative measurements of what we've done out there, as well as the other one I've seen in with different functional areas is monitoring through of the forest plan. And like those are kind of some of the ways that I can think of off my head, top of my head, where how we look at things quantitatively, but going out and having field trips, like I've always, after a few years and when you have time, and especially when people invest money in partners, taking them out. And then also just those Kumbaya field trips internally. I was on the Cibola. We went and did one down in the northern San Mateos, just internally with the specialist, and those are the best days in the woods. And it's always important to go back at some point and see either quantitatively or qualitatively meeting objectives or not.
After the fire, that'd be kind of my take on it. I mean, a lot of the communication that were going on beforehand, you're not seeing what actually happened on the ground, right? So we can talk about this or that or whatever, but I really, to your point, Pepe, I think that's to me, as a wildlife biologist, I'd say that's the most beneficial, right? Especially trying to understand fire effects. Because again, I probably have a little different background than some people, so I do have a forestry degree and got to run around the drip torch in grad school, but that isn't normal for us in the biology world. So I think that is where you learn the most. I will not even attempt to speak to the most optimal time to revisit. And maybe it's multiple times, maybe the initial after, so that those who aren't familiar with fire can really see what it looks like. I mean, I know we're all really busy. We have this conversation a lot on our unit of that we are so good at the upfront, get it out the door, get it done, but not the after part, like, talking about it, learning from it, revisiting over time. So I don't know if it's just a one-time visit, but yeah, definitely. And I agree with Dennis. Yeah, we really kind of are bad at the whole documenting for future generations unless you have those people out there with you that are new and learning that way. But the actual documentation part, I'd say we're pretty bad at that.
I add in from a public perspective, the image of from that war on fire frame and that fire is only destructive, to show that it isn't only destructive and that isn't dead to the general public as well as, perhaps to internal people. That's another side of bringing partners and letting them maybe be the messengers or giving them an opportunity after they've done that to have your partners talk to media. Like if the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation is saying, this fire did a lot of good for elk habitat, and what I'm seeing out there a few growing seasons later is great. That's a message you don't have to deliver, or the Forest Service doesn't have to deliver. Your partners are doing it for you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So you all talked about the great things about communication, how it can go right, how to best make it work. But can you think about maybe sometimes it didn't work and tell us about the most common pitfalls that you see in communication between fire and wildlife folks and how you could work your way out of them when you see them happening?
I like know he wants to jump on this, but I'd say that probably Jack, Dennis, and I have been through this a lot. I know Dennis alluded to this a little bit, and so did I. One of the biggest things that I've seen is just that lack of understanding, right? Again, as a wildlife biologist, typically whatever background we're coming from, we're not exposed to things like fire effects and what that actually means, talking about severity. So if I come to someone and say, hey, retaining these snags is a really big deal, and that's it, how, where I've seen it go wrong is that, like, I didn't explain the why. I didn't go out and help prep those snags. I didn't engage. I just put it on fire to go and do it and then expected it all be okay when I really didn't explain myself. So I think that's one of the biggest ones I've seen, not just with me, but with a lot of other people, like that, why is really big for all of us. Like nobody wants to be told, just go do something, right? Like why? So that really helps with that. But also engaging, right? It isn't just if I want something done as a biologist, I feel like it's important for me to engage too, right? It isn't fire's responsibility to go and do it. I should engage. The other one is I've seen it happen with a lot of us is specialist wise is we try to tell fire how to do stuff with no fire background whatsoever. So I think you should do this tactic wise or this to get some end results. And again, no one wants to be told what to do. I don't want people doing that to me. So I always try to be like, hey, here's the end results I'm looking for. I'm now going to trust fire people to go out and do that. And it works way much better when you take that approach than, dictating to people. Because again, I don't have the expertise that Dennis does. So really the question is, hey, this is what I'm looking for, Dennis. How do we make this happen on the ground? And then, he can use his skill set and all the other fire people to do that. So yeah, one of the biggest things is, okay, the two would be dictating to people and then just not engaging and understanding, really what that means when, from all the different terms we have for fire. So again, much like I was saying before, asking questions, getting out on the ground and looking, that they're huge. And I know we're all busy, we're all having to do all these things, but if we aren't taking that time to learn, then what are we really accomplishing on the ground if you're going to look just from the wildlife side for those species if we can't have that conversation and understand what's actually going to happen?
Great response, Julian. I'll tack onto it. Like the short answer is a compromise and trade-offs, right? And like a lot of us have said, it's like trying to understand, put your shoes in the other person, see where they're coming from, find some common ground. But whether it's sitting on an ID team and writing a NEPA and going through design features, or whether it's like on the ground and talking about it, we have to defer to each other's expertise and willing to listen and compromise and know that you're not always going to get your way. And the other big thing I'll say too, and Julia mentioned, it's hard to find time, everybody, for field trips or whatever, but I'd encourage anybody who can go participate in a prescribed fire. Like when our archaeologists, archaeology is so big on the Santa Fe. There's a lot of endangered species listed on the Santa Fe. and bringing those biologists out to come and burn with you, like our biologists were out on the MSO burns, like anything we can do to help them have some buy-in and feel part of that organization and help develop what that looks like and participate, and to get that slideshow and experience for future projects. It's priceless to have that kind of experience if you have the time to go out.
One thing I just wanted this is just great. This is gold for a lot of you younger biologists to hear some of this stuff, because lessons learned. I can just think of at the beginning, thinking that I had conservation measures that made sense in my mind, that it all great. I was writing out the document. I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And then, I had a wise mentor that said, you go out there, you get your street, he called it street cred. You go out there and you implement what you're telling them and see if it makes sense. And especially if you're on a fire, it's tough work. And let's see how it feels when you're actually trying to implement something one way or the other. If it's reasonable, those kind of things, it's a whole different story. And I remember at times going out there, and especially at the beginning of my career, I'd be a filler on a hotshot crew, especially back in the day when fire was a little bit different on prescribed fires and stuff. And they'd pull me and say, hey, I know this is especially on a prescribed fire. This is what you said, you emphasized. Can we show you something and see how can we give you an option and see what it's like? Well, I had a drip torch with them and I was with them. And so way I explained it sounded great, but it was going to be really labor intensive. I was going to bust my butt and be exhausted with them. And so they gave me the different option. It made sense. I was still going to get pretty much what I was trying to get at. And they gave me a different angle at it. It was going to be less intensive. It was going to save their folks a lot of time and labor. And I was there with them pulling it off. And I took that lesson. And then later on with those same folks, they understood that I was out there with them. It was that street cred. I was out there. I was putting my it wasn't just all talk. I was out there with them. I was explaining things with them. I had no problem doing that stuff. And it was huge. It was huge because the resources that I was caring about, they took it. They're saying, you know what? This guy's not all talk. He's not just an office jockey that's just lobbing stuff at us. He's out there and he's working with us. And so when he's not there with us, we want him, we take it that it's important also. And so it helped. It helped. A lot of our resource stuff end up having better results.
Yeah. And if you hadn't done that, right, the outcome is resentment, right? Theologists are making us do all this stupid stuff that we don't want to do. And, so either way, you're creating your workplace. And there's there are a lot of ways to communicate poorly. That transformative explanations, part of why you say the lay view is they know they've been heard. So to start with a judgment or to say, that's just stupid. But so instead, right, I'll tell you the way it is. But really listening to them and showing you've listened to them first is a much better approach.
So you have all talked about working with partners outside of just your agency, and it seems like a lot of these same concepts would probably apply to working and building those good relationships with those other types of partners. But is there anything in addition that people need to be mindful of when they are working across a boundary, across agency, or with these other kinds of groups, or just trying to build those relationships in the first place?
Great question. And I'll start. It comes up so often. We all have really good intentions when it comes to this kind of work. And the thing that popped in my mind that I'll share with folks is, in working with partners, be careful what you commit to, and have a plan up front and in place and thought out internally with your internal team. Like, I got to be on the same page as my biologist and my different specialists in-house before I go and talk to partners and make commitments about what we can or can't do. I think I'll just keep it at that. It's like, just always be careful about having a plan in place internally and having things squared away, have your house in order before you go out and start making promises or commitments to other partners. It's very important. You can, we often see, we don't do that. It gets a little jumbled up. It's not a perfect world. You can still get through it. It just seems to be, in my experience, painful and a little inefficient. Whereas when you do have a great plan in place and you got your team in line and you go and talk to your partner, it just makes things so much smoother and so much more streamlined when you have that plan before you make a commitment.
I also add that kind of what I alluded to earlier, but expanding it, like if you partners outside, so I'll just use the Forest Service since that's what I know, right? Different agencies, different partners all have a different mission typically than what we are. So, you know, we get pretty used to it working internally. And once you navigate all that, there's some nuances to it. I mean, I know you use, you know, Fish and Wildlife Service as an example before, like, you know, they are doing very similar stuff to us, which I hear oftentimes that's not the case, but you know, they are the advocate for the animal. We're the habitat manager, so we really have to be able to work together to do that. But maybe we have another partner who's focused on something specific, maybe watershed, this, that, and the other, you know, a specific piece of the pie. So just understanding that, you know, again, there's going to be a whole nother level of differences that come working across those boundaries. So just being really respectful of them and understanding. And, you know, maybe it's as simple as just asking, hey, what are you wanting here to start that conversation? So you all know, like Dennis was saying, that you're on the same page.
All right, we've got a question from the research side. What types of research products are most helpful to facilitate communication before, during, and after fires for optimal ecological outcomes while balancing other objectives? What can researchers and people like us at the Rocky Mountain Research Station provide to you all to be the most helpful?
I'm fortunate that I have done both research and land managers. Sometimes you have, you know, people just on one side of the fence or the other. So I feel like I kind of bridge this one really good. When you're talking as how can you help the land manager side communicate and then the different resources, there's obviously a lot of great information out there in research papers, but I'll admit that you're going to have a hard time getting a lot of people to look at those. Now, I know you all spend a lot of time on this, so this is not a knock, but a lot of times it's the more simple white papers, you know, that maybe are a page or two, have the photo, this sort of thing. That's really how, you know, from where I'm sitting, where I've seen it be most effective, of all that information that's out there. You know, I feel like there's a great ask for needs between, say, the land managers on the ground and the like, say, Rocky Mountain Research Station. So I think there's good questions that way. But to me, the most useful tool I've seen for sure is that white paper level. And the other one I would strongly throw out there is, you know, coming and talking to the units. Because a lot of times, you know, there's a disconnect because we're not all in the same place or we're not all interacting. So we're all in the same agency in this case, you know, with whether you're talking a research station and then the everyday Forest Service people, or however you want to, the people in the units, however you want to say that, we're all Forest Service employees. But anyway, that's another one. Because sometimes I think the land manager side, people may be afraid to come talk to the researchers because they don't know the questions to ask. So my thoughts.
That's a great one. It's the idea of talking amongst research and management. And it's the idea of asking questions regardless of how comfortable you are, or just communicating, telling you what you're struggling with, why, those kind of things. And a lot of time, just that feedback kind of percolates and the other folks actually can, you know, if you have enough of a relationship and they can come back and say, you know, remember that conversation we had? You said you were struggling with this. Well, you know, I didn't really understand how to really give you a good way to approach it or give you some good feedback. But I talked to my colleague. My colleague has seen this. They've been able to, they had a connection. And here, this is what they told me. This is the kind of stuff that I think we could maybe help you with, give you a better answer. And it all comes from dialogue. It doesn't always necessarily come from one-on-one with that individual researcher or vice versa, but they talk and they share that different information that they have. I know at least within our my department. We actually have a person that works for Rocky Mountain Research Station that attends our staff meetings, which is a huge plus. And not just having that weekly call or whatever it is I built that relationship. I'm able to talk to him and talk to them and then share, just like, hey, I can contact them on Teams. And I think Julia brought it up too, is that it's not just necessarily a paper but also white paper type things or quick responses, at least at certain levels, getting that information to your leadership at that right time can help you, because it can either help you get funding, it can help you get particular focus and on particular issues. And a lot of times research helps us, and especially in different meetings and stuff. That information that if we work it together, we're all in a lot of ways, we're trying to come up with the same answers anyways. But
Yeah, and that can help direct research, right? I mean, I've been out on fires with Incident Command, which fits my area. And, I learn a lot, but the incident commander was, you learn a lot, but we learn more from research than you do from us. And I think he's wrong. But it is that way to help shape questions, to push back on things that you may see or oversimplify in the abstract. So inviting research into your area can really help shape where research goes from there. I think from the research side, having white papers or more digestible things that I know that the communications folks at RMRS have been working on things like, for fire and strategy, they put out a set of videos on the San Juan, right? 5 different fires with 5 different strategies. And those are super helpful for me. They're helpful for others. And having that dialogue, and I think to get beyond just the researchers talking, getting people on the ground who have those experiences talking, it helps.
I'll tack on to all that. Everybody, well said. Same things. I've been growing a library, a literature library for years. It's very helpful. Those are the direct things you can use, the hands-on things. The white papers that everybody's mentioned are some of the best. I can still think of the one from Huffman that came out in 16 or 17, Efficacy of Wildfires and related to historic range of variation. That was a great one. That was a good one that any fire person could pick up, and there was pictures and it was simple and bulleted. It was great. Those products are good. And then all the Joe, Jack, and Julie are talking about, and I'll go back to that term I used in my opening about relationships. Like, I am very fortunate where I sit in northern New Mexico to have a lot of outstanding researchers that live in the area. And again, the relationships I built with them over the years has been so important to have that direct line of interpretation, not just reading a paper, but having direct communication over a beer with some of these folks about these issues is fantastic. And Joel, you said it great. Like, I never thought of it like that either, but it's kind of this two-way conversation where we learn from each other about, in my world, like what's possible with implementation, or like just the on the ground stuff, or like, and then feeding them up maybe potential research questions or whatever it might be. But I've always been a huge advocate for science informing land management. And when it comes to public interface, you have to. You absolutely have to. As mentioned earlier, it's not always best when it comes from the agency. So it's nice to have the researcher there to be able to explain things to the public, but it doesn't always go that way. But if you have that relationship and science is informing your management practice in your local area, and those relationships are in place where if something comes up and you got a question, it's invaluable to have those kind of relationships. And I would encourage any researchers out there, any of those white papers, they're fantastic, and I'm a big proponent of them.
Thank you all. All right, this is a bit of a tricky question that would definitely take many webinars to even start talking fully about, but how can we better address people who hold on to misinformation or when you are struggling to communicate what you are trying to share?
I think for me, right, misinformation and disinformation are 2 very different things. Right, misinformation, they have a perspective that you don't see as well, or maybe it's based on old knowledge. that transformative explanation slide of meeting them where they're at so they know that they're understood gives you a chance to help show them why that doesn't work. Give them examples, give them stories, and take time to engage in dialogue if you have that opportunity. But there are going to be different perspectives. And I do training in Line Officer Academy, and they talk about decision making from that side of the agency, that you're always going to be upsetting someone, right? Because they have a particular view. I just saw a piece that I was looking at where the person's answer is, I don't know why they do prescribed fire. I don't know why they're not going direct on every fire. And this is an environmental group. Like, I think they just like to watch stuff burn. Right. And I just like to watch stuff burn is not the answer most fire folks would say. I've been on prescribed fire and it is fun, but that's not the reason behind it. And how, finding those opportunities, I think, for dialogue, finding there are good facilitators out there. If it's a conflict that you really need to deal with in a longer, in a more detailed way, bringing in experts that can help facilitate environmental conflict negotiation. I know we have folks on campus, I'm not one of them, at the University of Montana that go out and do that kind of work, but really trying to engage them in dialogue, keeping it, not letting it get personal. Keep listening for where they're at. If you don't find common ground to start with, you're not going to have a chance of helping them reach your conclusion. If you can't find that common ground, it's not going to advance. Maybe at least then you can say, we've heard each other. I hear what you're saying, and here is what, and then explain your position. If you can't get to common ground and help create some movement, and maybe it'll create some movement in yours as well, your thinking as well. You never know.
Well said, Joel. That common ground piece is so important. And I always think about it in my mind as kind of this decision tree. It kind of starts with, okay, is fire part of our ecosystem or not? Yes or no. When people go to no, it's like, well, this is going to be a tough conversation. But it goes to yes, then you can start breaking down that decision tree to kind of find where you're not meeting, or where you're not, find the common ground, and where you don't have common ground. But I've been in northern New Mexico a long time. We have many adversarial groups. So I shouldn't say we have a very vocal minority here that's very against active management. And I read an article before here from one of the people that live here talking against managing wildfire and intentional burning. It's I've dealt with it my whole time here in the Santa Fe. And here's my thought about it. Think about it as a bell-shaped curve. I would say on one tail is everybody on this call, right? Is like we're the kind of the vocal minority. We're all in the business, and we actively engage with managers and researchers, etc. And we're very supportive. And then the great hump of the bell-shaped curve, you have kind of the silent majority, folks that like, either one way or another. They're not actively coming to your meetings and say, yes, go ahead and do this. It's like the greater majority of folks are in that big bubble, and then you have the other tail on the other end of the bell-shaped curve, and those are the people I was just referring to, and Joel kind of alluded to. It's like, and again, back to my decision tree, if you get to a spot where you're not going to find common ground, and they literally are just kind of out to throw wrenches, slow the process, or stop. And this is maybe a little harsh, but again, this is my experience in the last 12 years. I stop letting him bog it down, because you're starting to feed into what they want. Now, that doesn't say you don't ignore these people 100%. When certain issues come up, they have to be addressed at the force level and people attended to. But having the understanding that you're not speaking to that small tail, you should be speaking to everyone else, and really that silent majority. Don't get distracted to aim your conversations to try and change someone whose mind who's you're not going to change. Address them as need be, but speak to the larger part of that silent majority to change culture and get support.
I'll just throw one thing out here because I've seen it happen a lot. If you introduce yourself to someone, they find out you're from the Forest Service, and like attitude change right out there. There's a lot of people who don't have a lot of faith in the Forest Service, or don't like us, or don't like what we're doing. One of the ways I've seen it be very successful in helping some of those people understand that is actually engaging some of our partners. We're pretty fortunate here. I'm in Flagstaff. We have the city, we have the county, we have all sorts of other resources, Fish and Wildlife Service, all these different people that you can bring to the table. And oftentimes some of those people have a better relationship or have more open communication, whatever it is, as frustrating as it may be for you, the Forest Service person, or whoever's, I would, don't rule that out. I guess that can really kind of help, if someone else in your partnership sphere, can help with that misinformation side of things.
One thing I was just thinking, this is just really interesting. A lot of the work that we do in the Southwestern region deal with Mexican spotted owls and such. And, one thing that it's about always keeping dialogue. It's about talking to folks that don't always agree with you, because sometimes you have to understand the short game, mid game, and long-term goals and game, in the sense that you invest. And sometimes you look at, having, a variety of different people, partners involved in dialogue and with their different perspectives. But then also with research folks, that the more dialogue you have and more conversation, kind of input can help complex issues. Help eventually. It's that one time, that one meeting, that one field trip is the point where things kind of just go. The idea that people may have fought you for years, but it's that one time. It's because you invested in different partners, you invested for different viewpoints, and you weren't afraid to talk. And so it's that one time. It's just that one perfect spot, and you hit it right then at that one time. And it would have never happened if you were working in a vacuum. You're working in your own little bubble. It's the idea that don't be afraid to try. Sometimes those treatments or things that you did in the long term, it's that investment that maybe, it's a lesson learned for it worked. Maybe it was those kind of things that people were apprehensive of trying things because they were getting total pushback all the time. So it's a matter of getting different folks afraid to try different things, to think that, hey, what if I fail, and all that kind of stuff. There's lessons learned for all those different things that people down the road are going to use what you did, and maybe you figured it out, and you may not have known, but someone down the road saw what you did and it worked.
The last thing I'll just tack in that, and it's kind of based off of what all three of you said, is in a public meeting, for example, you get that one loud person that everybody in the room probably wishes they would just shut up. They aren't your only audience, right? The rest of the audience is there with you. And so you maintaining composure, you maintaining that perspective and sharing it, and finding your place of common ground. There might be a moment where you say, I feel like we've talked about this pretty well. If you want to have an individual meeting, if you want to make that offer, we can do that in the future. But I think other people have questions and interests, so you can rally that group to your side, drawing on partners. That was just another example of how things may go if it's a public meeting versus, working together in partnerships on decision making.
Thank you so much for diving into that here. We are just about at the end of the time, so I want to hear just like a 10-second answer from each of you for this last wrap-up question, and that is, what do you see as priorities for communication, specifically in the Southwest, moving forward from here?
I'll just throw it out real quick. Being adaptive to an adaptive system, being honest, transparent, and being humble and trying different things.
This may be kind of a personal thing I'd like to see. I'd like to see us in the Southwest get better, or eliminate using the words good and bad fire from our lingo, like totally make it go away. It comes up all the time, and fire adapted system. I'd really like to see that be out of our lexicon, not used. Yeah, drives me kind of batty. And so working very, very hard to get those two words out of in front of fire when we're talking about fire and fire effects.
I think myself, to be simple, be nice, be humble, and be empathetic. Those three things, it goes a long way.
I think those are great. You know, tell your story, listen to other people's stories, and you know, that be nice, be humble goes a long way, right? I was on a fire where the HR person said, as you're going out there, try not to be offended by what other people are doing or saying, and try not to offend, you know, a person who's offending others, you know, but you still have to be honest and forward.
Thank you all. Those are great things for everyone to remember here as we continue on with our days, our weeks, and our falls. Thank you everyone for coming out today. Thank you to our panelists. This recording will be posted in about a week and you can watch it there, share it there. And we hope to see some of you in Santa Fe in November as well. Thank you all.